All right, is everybody ready for round two? Are you enjoying the fire hydrant of information? Yeah? It just occurred to me, I was talking with somebody, I'm sure a lot of you haven't heard the theory about, Satan being a dragon, the intimidating thing and all that stuff, but that's not, I want to make it clear, that is not an official teaching of the church. That is one, and a good example of how theologians and biblical scholars are trying to make more sense of the temptation and the fall, but that is not an official teaching of the church. So you can accept it or not, in your will. You're free to do either one. Okay, so if you guys are ready to go for the second part, and we got to pick up after the fall. We got to pick up, Cain and Abel, and we got to move forward into the Tower of Babel. So this is the second half of our period, which, as we're studying the early world, chapters 4 through 11. All right, so let's get situated here. Take a deep breath. Here we go. The first thing that you notice in reading Genesis, chapters 4, 5, and pretty much from then on out, are genealogies, right? So-and-so is the father of so-and-so, who is the father of so-and-so. And when people read genealogies, they are boring. All right, they're boring. You start falling asleep. You skip over them. All right, everybody's asleep. Certainly in this image, everybody's asleep. But genealogies are important. And if you read along with the books that I recommended, you see why. And you're going to see why starting now, going all the way to Jesus. Because even on this chart, this red line, this red glowing line, is the genealogy of Jesus Christ. So the first thing that we notice, the first genealogy in the first story is Cain and Abel. And we all know the story. Cain kills Abel out of jealousy, out of envy. Okay, because essentially, if you read carefully, you'll notice that Abel gave the firstlings of his flock, but Cain just sort of gave something. Just kind of threw. Cain is a farmer. He's kind of threw a couple of moldy old carrots on the altar, but Abel gave the best. And so his offering wasn't accepted in envy. He goes and kills his brother. And you know the rest of the story, but I want to jump down to verse 17. Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch, and you got the first genealogy here. And you'll notice that this genealogy, you'll notice right away, this genealogy is evil. It's bad. Cain is the first murderer, commits fratricide. And then you read down 6 generations later, and you know why this importance of 6, right? That's the number of the beast. It represents the fact that Cain and his line have rejected their call for a Sabbath union, for this covenantal union with God. 6 generations later, you'll notice that this particular dude, Lamech, he embodies, or rather he commits sin or brings sin to the next level in 2 ways. First, you'll read in verse 23, Lamech said to his 2 wives. Well, hold on a second. Going back to Genesis 1 and 2, did God create Adam and Eve and Susan? Part of the marital covenant is, right, remember that first joke before? Christians have only one wife, and this is called monotony. No, it's monogamy. All right? Polygamy is wrong. So here, Lamech is taking 2 wives, taking women for his own pleasure, satisfaction, and corrupting the original plan for marriage and polygamy. The other thing here is violence. He's taken Cain's violence to a new level. All right, he says, I have slain a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain is avenged 7-fold, truly Lamech, I love saying that, Lamech, 77-fold. And we have the instances here, the beginnings of violence, perhaps even of warfare. And so violence and sexual immorality is now being increased 6 generations after Cain. This is the evil line. But we also read right after that, there's Seth, Seth's line. So Seth is another child of Adam and Eve. And in verse 26 it says, to Seth also a son was born. At that time, men began to call upon the name of the Lord. Calling upon the name of the Lord. This is a phrase that refers to worship. They are worshiping God. And notice something. If you can do your best, burn this word into your brains and remember it because it's going to come up over and over and over again. Name, name, name. It's a theme that's going to run throughout the rest of this talk now and then next week and then even later on with David and then Jesus. Name. The original word in Hebrew for name is Shem. All right, so hold on to that. The men began to call upon the name of the Lord. So you got the good line of Seth and you got the bad line of Cain. Everyone follow that? You'll notice if you continue to read chapter 5, well, we already saw the image where Seth is in Adam's image and likeness, all right, that father-son relationship. You read the rest of chapter 5, and you got the rest of his genealogy, all right? One of the great guys in his genealogy is Enoch, who was assumed into heaven. So talk about Mary's assumption. Well, we already got some guy in the 5th chapter of Genesis being assumed into heaven. So here is he walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. So this is a good line, and then ultimately out of this line is Noah. All right, so, okay, we've got to move on now to something extremely interesting. I don't know if any of you had the chance to read this, but in chapter 6, you find something incredibly strange, almost repulsive, all right, that a lot of individuals have misinterpreted as mythology. Let me just read chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. You read this. Men began to multiply on the face of the ground, and daughters were born to them. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were fair, and they took to wife such of them as they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh, but his days shall be numbered 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men that were of old, the men of renown. What? Angels did what? Has anybody been perplexed by this passage before? You're like, I don't get it. This is old stuff, Genesis. Moving on. No, this is extremely important. First and foremost, there is this interpretation that the sons of God, these sort of mythological creatures, perhaps angels, coming down and taking wives. We know that's not true for two simple reasons. It's impossible. Number one, angels are pure spirit. So to put it quite bluntly, they don't have the equipment to do the deed. They don't have the equipment to take human beings, human wives, and have children by them. All right, that's just obvious, isn't it? Pure spirit can't do that kind of thing. The second thing is, this particular event brings about the flood. The next verse is, God saw the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and then it goes on to talk about how God punishes all of humankind. He doesn't punish the angels. If there is some great sin being committed by the angelic host, why would he not punish the angels? Instead, he punishes all of humanity. Which points out that it could not be angels who committed that. It must somehow be actual human beings who could do the deed. Right? All right, two simple reasons to explain this fact. So what does it mean? We still have to answer that question. Keep it in context. So far, we've got the bad line and the good line, right? When God created Adam and mankind, they were in his image and likeness, which meant what? They were his children, his sons. So the sons of God must refer to who? Seth, exactly. Seth's line. The sons of God, those that walked with God, saw that the daughters of men, who are the daughters of men? Cain's line, saw that they were fair, they were being seduced. I don't know, they had some miniskirt on or something, some rouge, and they thought, whoa, nice. I'm a little older. These women are nice. So what's going on? They took wives as they chose. This is a line pointing out, again, the sexual immorality. Taking whatever woman they wanted, using them as objects. Falling away from the original design of not monogamy, all right? And being faithful in service to one's wife. And here we see that these lines intermarry. All right? The good line has now become seduced and corrupted. So polygamy is just going on, it's just getting worse and worse and worse, till now we run into the flood, where God says, this gone bad. Only one man is left who is righteous before me, and that's Noah. And so here we run into the flood. But so let me just explain really quickly here these Nephilim, because it does sound mythological, does it not? The Nephilim is simple in Hebrew. It means the fallen ones. The fallen ones. They're the ones that have fallen from God. Basta. Okay? the men of renown, as I have in the notes for you, simply means the men of the name. These are the men of the name. So you've got the good people who call upon the name of the Lord, but then you've got the bad ones, the ones that have fallen away, the fallen ones, the Nephilim, who are the men of the name. That's a second indication where this word is turned up. And we're going to see how it plays out in a little bit more. All right, they call upon their own name. Well, so again, keep that in your mind. Okay? Cain's line, they're trying to make a name for themselves in pride and disobedience. And now we have the flood. Sorry, I have this little slide right here. Just found this on the internet. I have no idea what that's about. But it's sort of, used for this mythological thing. Here's this somewhere in the Middle East, obviously, this huge skeleton being found. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. I just thought it was interesting. I wanted to share it with you. All right, so now we got the flood. This big event that takes place, which the church teaches is historical. The details of, what happened, their literary devices, so on and so forth. But Noah existed and a flood existed. And there's a lot of theological reasons for that. And we're going to talk about that. All right, but you've got this flood. You all know the story of the flood, right? 40 days comes. The flood lasts for 40 days, which is an obvious... We all know 40. At least we should. 40 is a number, meaning trial and testing. All right, all that stuff. And then God remembers Noah after this time and, takes care of him. The waters recede and all this stuff. Just really quickly, God remembering Noah. This is pointed out. It's really interesting. A lot of people point out, well, God is this sort of fickle God. It's like he's up there in heaven eating grapes, playing his harp, or having angels play the harp for them. And all of a sudden, I forgot about Noah. He's still out there bobbing up on the waves. I better go down and help him. No. The word is referring to his covenantal promise. God promised Noah in chapter 6, before the flood takes place, I'm going to establish a covenant with you. And then this word to remember is he is faithful to this promise, this covenantal promise. God's not fickle playing the harp, eating grapes, sort of like some sort of Greek god or Zeus or Bacchus or whoever else. It's a covenantal language. So when we see things like that, God is not like human beings. Yes, we've got to use human language to describe him, but we've got to understand the original language, the original time, and things begin to fall into place. All right, so this is also a very important part of Scripture because it tells us who the greatest financier in the Bible was. And that's Noah. He was floating his stock while everyone else was in liquidation. Oh, that's not bad. There are worse ones. Floating his stock, livestock, get it? It's pretty good. I thought we needed a little bit of... All right, moving on. Okay, so let's talk about this covenant. God remembers his covenant with Noah. This is the second covenant of all of salvation history. And the covenant sign is the rainbow. So if you just look at your chart one more time, I'll point out that Mr. Cavins and his team have pointed out, and in fact... You can find, the original source is Dr. Hahn's scholarly research. His dissertation is Kinship by Covenant, and actually the book, A Father Who Keeps His Promises, is a popular version of it. But you see how this covenant, the first covenant of one holy couple, is Adam. He's the mediator. It's one couple. It's a covenant that's rooted in marriage. Okay? And the sign is the Sabbath day. But now what we read about here with the flood is that God expands this covenant. The second covenant is with Noah is expanded to a family now. It's not just Noah and Mrs. Noah. It's Noah, Mrs. Noah, and their children and their children's wives. It's now expanded, and we're going to see this pattern throughout the rest of the covenants of the Old Testament and how they relate to Christ. Ultimately, he fulfills them all. So this is the second covenant that we see, and it's first mentioned in chapter 6, verse 18. I will establish my covenant with you. The flood takes place in 7 and 8, and then in 9, the covenant is established. Covenant is mentioned like more than half a dozen times, like 8 times or something, where God establishes this covenant with Noah. But it's just not arbitrary. Remember, the Old Testament builds upon itself. And what we see here is that the events of the flood itself, and everything that occurs is pointing towards a new creation. If you compare the original creation in Genesis 1 through 3 with this account of the flood, there are so many similarities pointing out that Noah is kind of like a new Adam. And of course, Christ is both a new Noah and a new Adam. But so here, Noah is like a new Adam and the flood is like a new creation. And there are so many things that takes place, so many similarities. And the reference here is in Hahn's book 84 to 85 for those of you who are going out to get it. So, number of things that take place. Number one, the world emerges from the deep in both accounts. The world emerges from the deep. The covenant number is prominent. What is the covenant number? 7, exactly. Seven is primarily of the covenant. Perfection, the number is 10. The number 10. All right, the dove, all right, Noah sends out the dove that hovers over the face of the waters. So too the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the waters. Both Adam and Noah are commanded, be fruitful and multiply. Go out and have cute little babies, all right? And let them just keep you up all night long. It'll be great. All right? Both are given dominion over the animals. God renews this covenant. In fact, the language being used is that of renewal. God renews this covenant with all of creation. Both, and even in the fall. So now number 7 and 8 that I have for you on the screen refers to the fall. Because you'll notice Noah does fall as well. Both are found in the garden, and both of them consume some sort of fruit that results in sin and results in nakedness. What fruit does Noah consume? The fruit of the vine. He gets a little tipsy. It's the first account of drunkenness in the Bible. All right? So maybe the Baptists are right. Wine is bad. Or maybe we just have it in moderation and it's okay. Moderation. I'm not giving up my wine. Okay, so you see this similarity here taking place, that with Noah, there is a new creation. And again, a typology moment. I've been talking about how things in the Old Testament are types of Christ. Remember, we talked about how Christ is a type of Adam. Remember that before the break? Here, same thing with baptism. The flood is a type of baptism. In the flood, the old world, the corrupted world, is washed away and purified for a new world. Okay? To reveal a new creation. This is exactly what Peter says in so many words. Jesus went to preach to the spirits in prison who had once been disobedient while God patiently waited in the days of Noah during the building of the ark, in which a few persons, that is 8 in all, were saved through water. Baptism corresponds to this now saves you. Baptism isn't a symbol. Baptism saves us, and he goes on to talk about how it purifies our conscience. It doesn't just wash away dirt, it washes our souls. Another typology moment here, this ark. The whole church, and the tradition of the church, has always understood the ark to be a type of the church. If you want to be saved from the flood, if you want to be saved from death, get inside the ark, which is the church. Through baptism to be washed pure and clean, and you will be saved for a new creation which will come at the end of time. Do you see the parallel there? You can see how this event of the flood points to greater realities in Jesus Christ and in the sacraments that He establishes. It's fantastic stuff. It's really, really great once you understand, again, St. Augustine's words, the new is hidden in the old and the old revealed in the new. All right, this is another instance of typology where you see how the two testaments fit together. All right, so there's the flood. After the flood, you got Noah's fall. I already explained, you can probably remember, Noah gets drunk, he lays in his tent, and he's naked. All right, and that's a bad thing. All right, we're in chapter 9, verse 20. Chapter 9, verse 20. Noah was a tiller of the soil. Oh, what was Adam? A tiller of the soil. Interesting. He planted a vineyard, and he drank of the wine and became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his 2 brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on their shoulders, and walked backward and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned away, and they did not see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan, a slave of slaves shall he be to his brothers." And he goes on and says, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem," or "Blessed be the Lord my God, be Shem, and let Canaan be his slave. God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his slave." What in the world is going on? Why? First off, you've got a couple of indications here in the text that, when it first starts off, Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father. So there's this reference between Ham and his son. But really, is it all that bad to see your father naked? I mean, I know that's, no one wants to think about that, let alone see it. That goes without saying. But really, to be cursed? And Ham, you notice, isn't cursed. Did you notice that? His son, Canaan, is cursed. Why? Why? You got to understand the original context, the original phrase. You know. Well, human beings are sexual creatures, right? It's part of our nature. We're created to procreate. And every culture has idioms. We got make love, and there are so many other vulgar and non-vulgar idioms that we have in English, all right, referring to the sexual act or variations of it, moral and immoral. The expression here, to see your father's nakedness, and one slide behind, in Leviticus 20 says something awful. The man who lies with his father's wife has uncovered his father's nakedness. And this expression, to uncover someone's nakedness, refers in some way to a sexual act committed against them. What did Ham do? Have you caught on? Ham has slept with his mother, or more likely raped his mother, forced himself upon his mother. And so that is why, well, I should say, Canaan, therefore, is the fruit of that rape, of that incestuous union. And that is why Noah curses Canaan, the fruit of this horrific sin. And Canaan, you know, goes in, and his descendants go in and occupy the land of Canaan. The Canaanites are his descendants. All right, and they became an incredibly sexually depraved people, committing incest and all kinds of different things. Sodom and Gomorrah, and it just goes on and on. Bad stuff, like father, like son. So why would he do this? Why would Ham force himself upon his mom? Again, Scripture tells us there are numerous cases. There's Reuben, we're going to talk about next week. There's also Absalom in 2 Samuel, in which basically what's being described is a power play. The blessing of the father. The blessing and everything that comes with the blessing is passed from the father to the firstborn son. Ham is not the firstborn son. Shem is the firstborn son. So what he's trying to do is take that power, take that blessing forcibly from the father. And the way to do it is to take the father's wife, even if it's your mother. So what Reuben did it, which was the firstborn son of, or not the firstborn son, oh gosh, his number escapes me. But Reuben did that by sleeping with his father, Jacob's concubine. And so did Absalom when he rebelled against his father, King David. The first thing he did was sleep with his father's concubines in public. Whoever has the wife has the power. Sex and politics have always been intertwined. I mean, the more things change, the more they stay the same, right? So this is the depravity behind his act. With this act of rebellion, he's trying to take the firstborn blessing for himself. And you can read about that again. I have the reference here in Cavins and Gray's book on page 27. All right. So Ham is trying to take Shem's blessing, take the blessing from the father forcibly. And that's important. And later on, Ham's descendants, or I should say the Canaanites, go in and take that promised land forcibly. The promised land has always been the descendant of Shem. And then through Shem, Abraham, and so on and so forth. And we're going to get to that in the conquering of the promised land. That land was never supposed to be the Canaanites. They took it by force. Does that help to explain that rather odd encounter? All right. It's really strange, really sick, but it explains it. It explains it. I think, anyways. I'm convinced. So, now, let's move on to the Table of Nations. Chapter 10. It's called the Table of Nations. How the descendants of Japheth, Ham, and Shem take place. And here in this map I have for you, you can see in general terms, Ham is around this area, Egypt, the Red Sea. Shem is, farther, northwest, this area of the Persian Gulf. And then Japheth goes farther north, the Black Sea, Greece area. And you can actually see, if you can go and look this up in particular atlases, all of their sons go on and spread. I want to point out here Ham's line. Remember, we still got these two bad lines, the evil line and the good line. Ham continues the evil line of Cain, and Shem, the firstborn, continues the good line of Seth. But if you'll notice, and you read Ham's line, you've got a couple of individuals here, fathers of nations, that should ring a bell for you. Egypt, Canaan, Philistia, Assyria, Babylon. These are all mentioned in chapter 10, verses 6 and following. Who are these people? These are major nations. They develop and become major nations. And they are all enemies, arch enemies of Israel, of Jacob, of Abraham, and ultimately of Shem. They are the ancient enemies. All of these peoples, it's like this bloodline, the good and the bad, consistently throughout salvation history, fight and war against each other. And it explains all the future feuds that we're going to read about in the conquest of Canaan later on. Does that make sense here? This is why genealogies aren't boring. They tell you the divine drama of what happens with the promised people and their enemies. Okay? So far, so good? New stuff for all of you? Yeah, I hope. I hope it's worth taking 2 hours of your night and coming to learn it. Okay, so, all right, so you got Shem's line is being described here at the second half of chapter 10. Okay, starting verse 21 and following. I wanted to point out one thing here. Chapter 10, verse 24, there is a guy named Eber, who is the father of or from which we get the term Hebrews. All right, because Eber, Hebrews, you can see the correlation here. The Hebrews follow this line of Seth. I just thought that was quite interesting to point out. Okay? All right, so after that, now we're coming into the last chapter of today's study, the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel. All right, we're in chapter 11. Okay, what's interesting here is you could point out really quickly. I think I will. I want to back up to chapter 10 just really, really quickly. Chapter 10, verse 8. Someone in Ham's line, his name is Nimrod, right? And he is a Nimrod. Right, verse 8, Cush became the father of Nimrod. He was the first on earth to be a mighty man. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. This is language of rebellion. He's a mighty, rebellious man before the Lord. All right, more than any other. Like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord is an expression. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel. Nimrod, a descendant, the grandson of, guess who? Ham, founded the city of Babel. Then he goes on in the land of Shinar and establishes Nineveh and a number of other different cities that ultimately become big major cities. Nations and kingdoms, empires come out of these people. So Nimrod is the father of Babel. Now let's talk about the Tower of Babel, and we know who the father of this land is. You with me? All right, that was important to point out. So in chapter 11, I just want to read the first 4 verses of chapter 11. Okay, chapter 11, verse 1. Now the whole earth had one language and few words. And as men migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar, where Nimrod went out, and they settled there. They said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves." What is the original name? I told you in Hebrew. Shem. Let us make a Shem for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad upon the whole face of the earth. And so, let me just read one more verse. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the sons of men had built. That's an expression you already know. It should ring a bell. The sons of men, these are rebellious men. All right, they had built. He comes down and he checks out the city. Okay. What is this Tower of Babel and what's happening here? Well, first, you recognize, and I kind of emphasized it while reading it, let us build a name for ourselves. This repetition of the name. What does it mean to call upon the name of the Lord? It means to worship Him, remember? All right, Seth's line did that. And then, of course, Shem, the firstborn of Noah, his name means name. It's like, hey, son, name, come over here, please. Please pick up your Legos or whatever. All right, his name means name. Shem means name. And so what did Ham do? Ham tried to take for himself the blessing, of Shem, his older brother. And Ham's descendant, so Shem possesses the blessing of Almighty God, the blessing that has come down from Adam to Seth to Shem now. And what Ham is doing is trying to take it by force. And they set themselves against God by making a name for themselves. Do you see that? They're refusing to call upon the name of the Lord and trying to make a name for themselves. And the Tower of Babel represents that. Do you follow that explanation? All right, that's extremely important. Now, What is this tower? Oh, I'm sorry. That is Lord of the Rings. That's not the tower, although it is quite evil. All right, the evil eye on the top. The true tower is what's called a ziggurat. A ziggurat. This is a historical, situation here. It's not like the first image I showed, which is more medieval artistic. This is the true tower. What is a ziggurat? A ziggurat was built, as you can see, in the form of this pyramid, and what they are were representations of mountains. And they believed that these representations of mountains, these ziggurats, actually entered into, in some way, the heavens, where they could have access to the gods. And on the top, they had all kinds of evil sacrifices, all right, to these sort of, false gods. So they believed they can build a direct tower up to heaven and have access to heaven through it with these sacrifices. What this whole thing represents false worship. A false worship of obeying the Sabbath and resting with God in this covenant union that He established with Adam and renewed with Noah. And they're going off and building a name for themselves, by themselves. And so God comes down and sees this city, this tower. Sort of like, and that's important, He comes down to it. This mountain doesn't get even close to heaven. Sort of like a father comes down, as I was talking about the Legos, right? Oh, that's a cute little Lego tower you guys made. How adorable. And he realizes absolutely not. What they're doing is they've got unity at this point. The unity of humanity is now being served to rebel against God. And so God destroys the unity of humanity by giving them multiple languages, and then they begin to scatter throughout the earth. That original unity that they had in Adam is now destroyed. And what we're going to begin to see is God is going to plan to restore that unity that was destroyed at the Tower of Babel. He's going to slowly begin to restore it with some promises and covenants that He makes with Abraham. Okay, so that's sort of like a lead for next week. All right, after the tower, does everyone make sense? Does that make sense to people? Okay. After this whole instance with the Tower of Babel, which becomes Babylon, a city that ultimately takes off Judah into exile and destroys the temple, again, an ancient arch enemy of Israel, you've got, again, the descendants of Shem. Chapter 11, verse 10. Again, you got this play on the word name. You got the bad line making a name for themselves, and you got the good line in Shem. And you've got the descendants of Shem begin to be described in chapter 11, verse 10, all the way down to 26. Who is at the end of that line in 26? Abram. Because Abram is of that divine line. Now, that last point is the lead into the next section, which is, there's Shem, by the way. The next section, which is the patriarchs. We've got to understand what God accomplishes through Abram, whose name turns to Abraham, and the rest of the patriarchs. All right, so this is the next period that we're going to see here. And that concludes tonight's lesson. So, what's that? Oh, these chapters, the rest of the Genesis is 12 to 50. You're not going to read it all. I mean, you could, technically. But again, you read as much as you can if you want. But these presentations, these lectures, and this Bible study that we have here with the notes, the books, are there to give you the background, the foundation. And then you can slowly read it on your own. Because remember, we're going to break. We're going to do 5 weeks. We're going to break for November and December. After the new year, we're going to continue on with the rest of the Old Testament and then break for Lent. So you have opportunity to soak it up, to read and to reflect.
You said lesson 3, the patriarchs. Where will I find it over here?
The patriarch starts in chapter 12. Yeah, the very next chapter. Great. So you guys have any questions at all for me? Can I have a little feedback? Did that make sense, this progression here? Yeah? Okay. Question here, and then you, sir. One sec. Go ahead.
The ages.
The ages. Okay, I'm expecting 2 questions to come up right now. The ages. These guys lived a long time, right? 900 years. Methuselah was like 930 something or other. He's got the Guinness Book of World Records. This isn't an original problem. St. Augustine actually. Everyone pretty much knows St. Augustine. He wrote, his greatest work is called The City of God. The City of God, in fact, the origin of the City of God versus the City of Man goes to Cain and Seth. His whole theology is based upon Scripture, it's salvation history. So I believe it's in chapter 15, he begins to discuss these problems like long life. How did they really live that long? And the answer is, and there are all kinds of interpretations, even back 2,000 years ago, maybe year represents something else, maybe every year represents 6 months or whatever. And he goes on to demonstrate conclusively that a year is a year. And yes, they did live that long. Before the flood, they lived long, which really helps to explain how the population boomed almost right away. Because in 900 years, could you imagine how many children? So the answer is, yes, there's nothing in the text or in tradition, both Jewish and Christian, to suggest that it is symbolic for some other length of time. It is actually 930 some odd years. Way past retirement. Oh, yeah. Well, you could either say retirement age was at 70 and they had a great long golden stretch of years. But no. Yeah, save a lot of money. Must have had great interest rates back then. Any other questions? Yes, sir?
I was wondering what the previous work of the devil was Satan.
Yeah.
A lawyer?
Oh, was Satan a lawyer? No comment. No comment. Yeah?
One last comment.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, thanks. That reminds me, thank you. That reminds me, the other joke that I didn't say, that some stuff I steal, some stuff is original. If it's bad, it's original. If I stole it, it's good. Wow, so thank you. When Adam saw Eve, he said, "Whoa, man," from which we get woman. Yeah. Of course, you better believe it. Yeah, another question?
Books that you recommend.
Yes.
I cannot read all of them.
No.
At the same time. Which would you choose?
Okay, that's a great question. Which of these books would I recommend? For the purposes of this course, now remember, this course lasts all year till after, so you can read it slowly, read one chapter. The book that most closely fits the 12 periods of history is this book by Mr. Cavins and Dr. Gray. Because the chapters are organized and written by the time periods. So chapter 1, if I'm not mistaken, is the early world. So this would be an obvious choice. Pardon me. The name is Walking with God, A Journey Through the Bible. And St. Marie Bookstore over on La Rue des Courtiers, as somebody corrected me before, is on the west side. They've got these. You get 10% off. Support a local Catholic bookstore, and you can get a discount. But make sure you tell them you're at this Bible study. And then the other book I recommend, really, if you could get both and sort of munch on both, because you got the lectures, then you're going to read both. It's not going to be heavy reading. A lot of it will be building upon each other. It's Dr. Hahn's book, which they built off of. All right, kind of chronologically speaking, A Father Who Keeps His Promises was published first. And then so Jeff Cavins sort of combined Dr. Hahn's scholarship and insights to his Bible timeline plan. Does that make sense? So A Father Who Keeps His Promises by Dr. Hahn, and the other one is Walking with God. If you can slowly, gradually read both of these throughout this next year and later, going back and reading. I mean, I don't know how many times I've read A Father Keeps His Promises, but I mean, part of our fallen nature is our memory, right? That's what I hate most of all. Our memory doesn't stick. So you can go back and read. All right, good question. Any other questions? I forgot to put discussion questions up on a slide. Technically, the bell's not going to ring for 15 minutes, but I mean, obviously, if you got to go, please feel free to go. But I want to encourage more discussion stuff. Yeah.
What was the second question you were expecting?
Oh, you were going to ask that. What is the second question I was expecting? The second question I was expecting, which I'm sure some of you are thinking, is who did Cain and Seth marry? Right? It just mentions in the first chapters. Cain took a wife, and there goes the genealogy, which points out something important. These chapters are not, they don't have a complete genealogy, right? They're talking about, the author is writing this for a specific purpose. The what and the why in terms of creation, at least. The what and the why, not how in terms of evolution or whatever. And so there's a lot of things left out. We don't know, chronologically speaking, how much time Genesis 1 through 11 took place. In fact, if you look on your charts, you'll notice on the bottom of this period, the early world, there is no date. But then all of a sudden, when you get to the patriarchs, we know it's about 2000 BC. So we don't know how much time it took. These chronologies are incomplete. So, again, St. Augustine, he addresses this issue in the City of God, as do other early church fathers. Who did they marry? And the answer is obviously, because the church tells us, as well as Jewish tradition, the unity of the human race. God created, we don't know how, but God created one man and one woman, and they are the origin of our human race. So, naturally, there must have been some sort of sibling marriage going on. There had to be. But God permitted that for a certain amount of time, so that way the population could boom. And you'd only need a generation or two, and then that's it. Or then later on you read in Scripture, God forbids it because there's no need for it anymore. And you got to begin, at least scientifically, we know you've got to mix up the genetic pool. So, yeah, I mean, sibling marriage. And that's always uncomfortable to kind of think about, but God permits it, lawfully permits it in the beginning, so that way the human race can develop. That was the second difficult question I was expecting. So, yeah, thanks for putting me up into a corner. Any other questions? So you're feeling pretty good so far? Now, it goes without saying, but next week is extremely important, because next week sets the stage. It really lays out the rest of the plot of all of Scripture. Abraham's the father of the faith for a reason, so he's the father of salvation history, because what happens with him is going to lay out the rest of the whole Bible. So I really encourage you to make it if you can. We have extra timelines if any of you are new. If you want to invite people, absolutely. Again, thank you so much for coming. Feel free to stay and talk if you want. Otherwise, we'll see you all next week.